The snow had been falling since noon, and by the time Marcus Beaulieu pushed open the door of the Riverside Family Restaurant, on the edge of Trenton, Ontario, his boots were soaked clean through. He held the door a beat longer than he needed to, just to let his son slip in ahead of him out of the wind. Theo was 7, small for his age, and he came in shaking snow off his toque like a dog after a bath, grinning up at his father as if walking into a half-empty diner on a Tuesday night was the best thing that had happened all week. For Theo, maybe it was. Marcus had worked a double at the recycling plant, sorting belts and bins until his shoulders ached in a way he was getting too familiar with for a man of 36. The plant ran cold in winter no matter how many layers a person wore, and he'd spent the last 4 hours with his hands going numb, thinking about nothing except the moment he'd get to pick Theo up from Mrs. Lapointe next door and tell him they were doing something special. Something special. He'd promised it that morning, before the sun was up, while Theo was still rubbing sleep out of his eyes over a bowl of the no-name cereal that was the only kind they bought now. Friday's payday, Marcus had said. We'll go somewhere with a real menu. You can order whatever you want. He'd said it like it was nothing, like it was easy, and he'd spent the whole drive to the plant doing the math in his head, the way he always did, the math that never quite came out right. The test had come back. That was the thing. Theo's reading test, the one his teacher had warned might mean he'd repeat a grade, had come back, and Theo had gone from a level 2 to a level 5, and the teacher had written a note in careful blue ink at the top of the page that said Theo worked so hard. You should be proud. Marcus had read that note 4 times standing in the kitchen, and then he'd folded it and put it in his wallet next to the photo of Theo's mother. And he decided that some promises a man keeps even when the math doesn't work. So, here they were. The restaurant smelled like gravy and coffee, and the particular sweet warmth of a deep fryer running, steady, and a string of half-burnt-out Christmas lights still hung in the window, even though it was the 3rd week of January. A woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair came around the counter and told them to sit wherever they liked, and Marcus steered Theo toward a booth by the window, where they could watch the snow come down sideways under the streetlights. Theo opened the laminated menu with both hands, the way he opened everything important, and his eyes moved down the page slow and serious. You sure, he asked. About anything I want? Anything on there, Marcus said. You earned it. Level 5. He reached across and tapped the menu where it said hot hamburger sandwich, served with fries and gravy. You always wanted to try that. The one with the gravy on the bread. Theo's whole face changed. And a chocolate milk? And a chocolate milk. The boy ducked his head down behind the menu, so his father wouldn't see how happy he was, which was its own kind of thing to watch, and Marcus leaned back against the vinyl seat and felt his back unclench for the first time all day. He ordered a coffee and a bowl of soup for himself, because soup was cheap and filling, and a man can tell himself he isn't hungry for a lot of years if he has to. He had exactly enough in his account to cover the meal, the chocolate milk, a decent tip, and a tank of gas to get them through to the next pay. He'd checked twice in the parking lot. The numbers worked tonight, barely, but they worked. The food came faster than Marcus expected, the waitress setting down Theo's plate with a flourish, the open-faced sandwich drowning in gravy, the fries golden and stacked high, and Theo looked at it like it was a thing in a museum. Something you weren't allowed to touch. Then he picked up his fork and got to work, and Marcus blew on his soup and watched his son eat, and for a few minutes the cold and the plant and the math all went quiet. That was when the bell over the door rang again. A woman came in out of the storm with a little girl by the hand, and the cold came in with them, rolling across the floor in a wave Marcus could feel 3 booths away. The woman's coat was the wrong coat for the weather. A thin spring jacket zipped to the chin, and her hair was plastered to one side of her face where the wind had taken it. She stamped the snow off her sneakers, and stood just inside the door, not moving toward a table, just standing there with her daughter's mittened hand in hers, scanning the room in a way Marcus recognized. He recognized it because he had stood like that before. She wasn't looking for a table, she was looking for the washroom sign, or the prices, or for whether anyone was watching. She was doing the math too. The little girl was maybe 4, swallowed up in a snowsuit that was too big and faded at the knees, and where her mother's eyes moved fast and nervous, the girl's eyes had found one thing and stopped. She was looking at Theo's plate, at the fries, at the way the gravy steamed up off the bread. She wasn't looking the way kids look when they want a treat, all bounce and wheedle. She was looking the way you look at something you've decided you can't have. Still, quiet, like, if she looked hard enough she could taste it. Marcus knew that look. He'd seen it on Theo's face 2 winters back, after the layoff, in the long stretch of weeks when supper was toast and whatever was in the cupboard, and the boy had stopped asking for things because he'd learned that asking only made his dad's face go strange. A child who stares at food like that has learned something no 4-year-old should have to learn. Marcus felt it land in his chest like a stone going down a well. The woman caught her daughter looking. He watched it happen. She gave the small hand a gentle tug and bent down and said something close to the girl's ear, and the girl nodded and dropped her eyes to the floor, and the mother turned them both back toward the door. Whatever she'd come in for, the warmth or the washroom, or just a minute out of the storm, the looking had become too much, and she was leaving before anyone could decide to feel sorry for her. Yeah, she had her hand on the door when Marcus stood up. Didn't plan it. His soup spoon was still in his hand. "Hang on," he said too loud, and then quieter when she flinched. Sorry, I didn't mean to." He set the spoon down. "It's brutal out there. You don't have to rush off on my account." The woman turned around slowly. Up close she was younger than the tiredness made her look, maybe early 30s, with the kind of careful, braced expression of someone who'd learned to expect a catch. "We're all right," she said. "Thank you." Her voice was polite and final, a door closing softly. Marcus looked down at the little girl, who had risked one more glance at the fries and then gone back to studying the floor tiles. "Has she eaten?" he asked. It was the wrong question and the right question both at once. The woman's face did something complicated, a flush climbing up from her collar, her chin lifting. "We're fine," she said again, and this time there was an edge under it, pride pulled up like armor. And then, into the silence, the little girl's stomach growled. Loud enough that the waitress at the counter looked over. Loud enough that the only other customer, an old man with a newspaper, glanced up. The girl wrapped her arms around her middle as if she could muffle it, mortified in the way only a small child can be. And her mother closed her eyes for half a second, and Marcus felt the whole room go still. It was Theo who broke it. He'd been watching all of it from the booth, this small grave 7-year-old with gravy at the corner of his mouth, and without a word he pushed his plate forward, sliding it across the table toward the empty seat. "She can have some of mine," he said. "I can't finish it anyway." Which was a lie, because he'd been eating like it was the last meal on earth, but he said it with such plain certainty that nobody could argue with it. The woman looked at the plate, and then at the boy, and then at Marcus, and her composure cracked right down the middle. She pressed her lips together, "That's really kind. But I can't let you do that, we don't take charity." She said the word charity like it tasted bad. I'm sorry, we should go." Marcus had heard that word in his own mouth before. He knew exactly the shape of it, the way it stuck in your throat, the way it was sometimes the only thing a person had left to hold on to when everything else had been taken. So he didn't argue. He didn't tell her it wasn't charity, didn't insult her by pretending the obvious wasn't true. Instead he pulled out the chair across from Theo, the empty one, and he said, "Then it's not charity. It's 2 tired parents letting their kids wear each other out so we can drink a coffee in peace for 10 minutes. He almost smiled. "My boy's been talking my ear off since I picked him up. I could use the backup." The woman stood very still. Outside the wind threw a fistful of snow against the glass, and something in her shoulders came down. Just slightly, the armor loosening one strap. 5 minutes, she said, until it lets up. 5 minutes. Marcus agreed, like they were striking a hard bargain, and he caught the waitress's eye and lifted 2 fingers and mouthed 2 more plates, and the waitress, who had been watching the whole thing, gave a small nod and didn't write anything down. The little girl needed no further convincing. She climbed up beside Theo, who very generously divided his fries into 2 unequal piles, the larger pile sliding toward her, and she ate the way the truly hungry eat, fast at first, then slower as the worst of it eased, glancing up between bites, as if to make sure the food wasn't going to be taken away. The mother sat down across from Marcus and folded her wet hands in her lap and did not eat. "Daphne," she said finally, like she was setting something down she'd been carrying. "I'm Daphne, that's Rosie." "Marcus, that's Theo." He nudged a paper napkin toward her. "Eat something, Daphne, the kids are fine, look at them." The kids were fine. Rosie had discovered that Theo could make his eyes go crossed. And Theo had discovered an appreciative audience, and the 2 of them had fallen into the immediate uncomplicated friendship that small children fall into, the kind adults forget how to have. Daphne watched them and something unguarded crossed her face, and when the waitress set down a plate of the daily special in front of her without a word, Daphne looked at it for a long moment and then picked up her fork, and her hand shook, just a little. "We've been in the car," she said quietly, not looking at him, looking at her daughter, Since the second week of December. I keep telling myself it's not as bad as it sounds. I run the heat in stretches so the battery holds. There's a Tim Hortons that doesn't mind if we use the washroom. Rosie thinks it's camping. Her mouth twisted. She told the lady at the food bank we go camping every night. The lady looked at me like. She stopped. Marcus didn't say anything. He'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing was to leave room. It wasn't supposed to go like this, Daphne went on. I had a place. I had a job at the call center and a one-bedroom on Dundas, and it wasn't much, but it was ours. Then, Rosie got sick in the fall, the pneumonia, and I missed too many shifts staying at the hospital with her, and they let me go, and once you miss 1 month's rent you might as well have missed 6. She set her fork down. Everybody tells you to just get help, like there's a building somewhere with a sign that says help and a parking spot out front. It's all wait lists. There's a wait list for the shelter. Did you know that? A wait list. For the shelter. I didn't know that, Marcus said. But part of him had known, the part that had spent 2 winters one missed paycheck from exactly here. I'm not telling you this so you'll. Daphne shook her head. I don't even know why I'm telling you this. You bought my kid French fries and now I'm. She laughed, but it came out wet. Sorry, I'm sorry. You don't have to be sorry, Marcus said. Not for any of it. You're keeping a 4-year-old fed and warm in a car in January. That's not something to apologize for. That's about the hardest job there is. Daphne looked at him then, really looked, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to land, because she nodded slowly and went back to eating. And this time her hand was steadier. They talked. Not about the hard things, mostly, but around them, the way strangers do when something has cracked open between them. She'd grown up in Belleville, just down the highway. She'd wanted to be a nurse once, had even started the program, before money and timing and 100 small disasters had closed that door. Marcus told her about the plant, about Theo's reading test, about how the kid had clawed his way from a level 2 to a level 5, and how he'd promised him a real supper, and how that promise was the reason they were all sitting here at all. Daphne smiled at that, a real smile, and Marcus thought it changed her whole face, made her look like the person she'd been before the car and the wait lists and the cold. Theo and Rosie had moved on to building a fort out of the little plastic creamer cups, and the waitress had quietly refilled Daphne's coffee twice without being asked. And outside the snow kept coming, and the 5 minutes had stretched to 40 without anyone naming it. It was Theo again, who said the thing that turned the night. He'd been listening more than Marcus realized, the way kids do, soaking up the grown-up words from the edges of the conversation. He tugged his father's sleeve and Marcus leaned down, expecting a question about dessert. Instead, Theo whispered, not quietly enough, "Dad, if they live in the car, where do they sleep when it's this cold?" The table went quiet. Daphne's smile faltered. She opened her mouth, probably to say something reassuring, something about camping, and Marcus watched her run out of the will to say it. Marcus straightened up. He thought about his apartment. The second-floor walk-up on Dufferin with the radiator that clanked, and the window that didn't quite seal. 2 bedrooms, technically, though the Cessant was barely a closet with a window and held nothing but Theo's bed and a milk crate of toys. He thought about the math that had barely worked tonight, the math that never had room in it for anything extra. He thought about how he had nothing to spare, truly nothing, and how that was exactly the kind of thinking that had nearly broken him 2 winters ago, when the only reason he and Theo had made it through. Neighbor named Mrs. Lapointe, who'd started leaving a covered plate on his doorstep 3 nights a week and pretending she'd just made too much. People had helped him when he had no claim on their help. That was the whole truth of how he was still standing. "It's supposed to drop to -20 tonight," Marcus said. He kept his voice low and even, like he was discussing the weather and not turning his small, careful life upside down. "With the wind chill, colder, a car's not going to cut it." "We'll be okay," Daphne said automatically. "We've made it this far." "I've got a couch," Marcus said. "It's an old couch. The apartment's nothing to look at and the radiator sounds like somebody's hitting it with a hammer, but it's warm. And there's a door that locks." He held up a hand before she could refuse. "Just tonight, just till the cold snap breaks. Rosie can bunk in with Theo. He's been after me for a sleepover his whole life and there's nobody to invite. You can have the couch, I'll take the floor. Nobody's doing anybody a favor. We're just 2 people getting through a bad week." Daphne stared at him, and he watched the refusal rise up in her, automatic, armored, and he watched it meet something else, something that had been worn down by a month in a cold car and a 4-year-old who told strangers they went camping. Her eyes filled. She looked over at Rosie, who had fallen asleep mid-sentence against Theo's shoulder, the way exhausted children do, suddenly and completely, a plastic creamer cup still in her fist. "You don't even know me," Daphne whispered. "I know enough," Marcus said. "I know your kid's asleep and it's -20, and you've been carrying this by yourself for too long. The rest we can figure out in the morning." For a long moment she didn't speak. The waitress had drifted to the far end of the counter to give them room. The old man with the newspaper had gone. The Christmas lights blinked their tired blink in the window and the snow came down. And Daphne Tremblay sat in a vinyl booth in a roadside restaurant and let herself for the first time in a very long while, except that she could not do all of this alone. "Just tonight," she said, and her voice broke on it. "Just tonight," Marcus agreed. They both knew it would not only be tonight. Some things you say to give a proud person an honorable way through a door. He paid the bill at the counter, and it came to more than the math had allowed for, and he left the tip anyway, and the waitress pressed a paper bag into his hands as he turned to go. "2 slices of pie," she said, "that were just going to get thrown out. No sense letting them go to waste." And she would not hear otherwise. Her name tag said Pauline. Marcus would think about Pauline for a long time after. About how the helping had come down the line that night from person to person. Each one passing it along like a coal kept alive from an older fire. They bundled the kids into coats. Theo carried Rosie's mittens. Marcus carried Rosie, who didn't wake, her head heavy against his shoulder, and the trust in that small dead weight nearly undid him right there on the salted sidewalk. Daphne went ahead to clear the snow off her windshield out of habit. Before she remembered she was leaving the car where it sat, and Marcus told her it would be fine in the lot overnight. And she laughed at herself, a real laugh. And the sound of it under the streetlight in the falling snow was the best thing Marcus had heard in a year. They drove in 2 cars across the quiet white town, Daphne's headlights in his mirror the whole way. And Marcus thought about how that morning he'd been a man doing impossible math alone in a cold parking lot, and how somehow by nightfall there were 4 of them, and how the apartment that had always felt too small was about to feel, for the first time in a long time, full. He didn't know yet how the morning would go, or the morning after that. He didn't know that Daphne would find work at the long-term care home by spring, or that she'd finally go back and finish the nursing program 2 years later, or that Rosie and Theo would grow up calling each other something close to family. He didn't know any of that yet. Standing in the stairwell with a sleeping child in his arms, fishing for his keys, hearing Daphne's footsteps come up behind him out of the cold, all he knew was that he'd noticed. A hungry little girl had stared at a plate of fries, and he had not looked away, and that turned out to be the whole thing. That turned out to be everything. Warmth, it turns out, is not something you have or don't have. It's something you pass on, in a paper bag, across a table, up a dark stairwell, on the coldest night of the year. And the strange arithmetic of it, the math that never works on paper, is that there is always, somehow, enough. I keep coming back to the math. Marcus did the numbers twice in a freezing parking lot that night, and they barely worked, and he gave away a warm couch and half his grocery week anyway. On paper that's a foolish man. But I've lived long enough to know the paper lies. The cold arithmetic of a tight life tells you to look after your own and let the rest of the world sort itself out, and if Marcus had listened to it, Daphne and Rosie would have spent -20 in a car with a dying battery, and he'd have gone home a little less broke and a lot less whole. What strikes me is how nothing in that night was an accident. Marcus noticed Rosie staring at those fries, because he'd once watched his own boy stare the same way after a layoff. He didn't flinch from Daphne's pride because he'd carried that same pride in his own throat. Mrs. Lapointe had left covered plates on his doorstep 2 winters earlier, and so a couch felt like the only sensible thing to offer. Kindness, I've come to believe, isn't a feeling that strikes you, it's a debt you've decided to keep paying forward. One cold night at a time, and the people who do it best are usually the ones who remember exactly how it felt to need it. There's a kind of goodness here that costs something, and that's the only kind that counts. Anybody can be generous with a full account. It takes real character to be generous when your own back is against the wall. And Marcus had built that character the slow way, through years of being the one who went without so Theo wouldn't. That's worth teaching a kid, I think. Not the easy charity of leftovers, but the harder decency of seeing a person clearly and refusing to look away. I also think about the quiet smarts of how he did it. He didn't lecture Daphne or shame her into accepting help. He read the room, found her pride, and built her an honorable door to walk through. 2 parents letting their kids wear each other out. That's wisdom dressed up as a small joke. And it saved her dignity in the doing. Good intentions clumsily delivered would have driven her right back out into the snow. And underneath all of it was plain stubbornness. The refusal to quit that Daphne had been running on for a month of camping, that wasn't camping, and that Marcus had been running on for years. The world wears people down. It put a wait list on a shelter, for God's sake. The ones who make it through aren't the ones it spared. They're the ones who kept getting up. So when people ask me what the story means, I tell them the truth I take from it. Notice. Then act, even when the math says you can't afford to. The strange thing about warmth is that the more of it you give away, the more of it there somehow turns out to be.